I'm sharing the right screen. Okay,
perfect, all good.
Okay, brilliant. How is it moving along nicely? No, it's not.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks, Graham. Thanks for the intro, and thanks for everybody attending. I know it is not the sexiest of subjects in the world, but I do appreciate that some people are interested in it and want to do a good job in managing their risk associated to Legionella and any waterborne pathogens. So I suppose the opening slide really says there that the Legionella risk assessments and the new British Standard 8580 2019, I'm saying it's still new because it's still relatively in its infancy. It's only a few years old. We had COVID in between, and a lot of things have happened since that date. And I'm talking to you today because I've had 25 years in the industry. I've been involved in 2 Legionella outbreaks, one in Barrow and one in Edinburgh. And thankfully, neither of them were anything to do with myself, nor the organisations I was working for, nor the organisation that I was subcontracting on behalf. But what it did do is it gave me a good understanding and background knowledge as to how Health and Safety Executive, the Environmental Health Officers and the Care Quality Commission all go about their day-to-day business and finding issues with sites and what happens on the back of outbreaks and such like. And one of the things that we have decided to do in the water treatment and water hygiene industry is try and sort of get a better document to tell us how to do a good and proper Legionella risk assessment. And various documents have been produced. So the Approved Code of Practice, L8, HSG 274, Part 1, 2, 3. And we've now got a British standard document for how we actually deliver a risk assessment, which is to try and make all of those other ancillary documents try to fit more hand in glove and try to be a little bit better for the person, A, who's doing the risk assessment, and B, who's trying to understand the risk assessment, those who actually read the risk assessment and do something about it. So in 2019, this document was produced to show people and to tell people and to help people deliver a good quality risk assessment document and what it covers. So I'm going to get started. And what it is covering is Legionella risk assessments. Why are they needed? British Standard 8580 version 1 2019. What does it include? And do your risk assessments comply? And what are the key points to take away? And we all know that there's a whole myriad of documents, health and safety at work, management health and safety at work regulations, RIDDOR, IOSH, etc., that tell us that we need to keep people safe. And these documents are there. The Management Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999 require employers to put in place arrangements to control health and safety risks. And as a minimum, that you should have the processes and procedures required to meet the legal requirements, which include, but not exhaustive, a written policy to define what that Legionella and waterborne pathogen management is encompassing. We need to have assessments of the risks to employees, contractors, customers, partners, and any other people who could be affected by your activities, surrounding the environment, for example, and record those significant findings in writing, especially if you employ 5 or more people. And any risk assessment must be suitable and sufficient, or deemed to be suitable and sufficient. And hopefully, this British Standard document gives you a little bit of background as to what deems a suitable and sufficient risk assessment. We're also meant to have arrangements for the effective planning, organising, control, monitoring, reviewing of preventative and protective measures that come from this risk assessment. And we've got to have access to competent help or competent health and safety advice. Now, that could be somebody who's within his or her own organisation. It could be a water treatment consultant, a risk assessment, or a water treatment company, for example. And we're also meant to provide employees with information about the risks in your workplace and how they are protected. We should provide information on the instruction of how to use equipment, training for employees in how to deal with the risks, for example, and ensure that there is an adequate and appropriate supervision in place, consulting with employees about the risks and current preventative and protective measures. So a whole myriad of things. And this is that slide in a little bit of detail there. Getting help with health and safety, risk assessments, consultation, the work between the workers, get insurance for your business, the law, display the law poster, for example. And all of these things are, probably on a day-to-day basis being done by lots and lots of organisations. But we need to do that in relation to water hygiene and the risks from Legionella and waterborne pathogens. And we've got a hierarchy of control. Eliminate. Well, we can't, unfortunately, we can't eliminate, or fortunately, we can't eliminate water from our operations. We can't reduce or substitute. We can't isolate or engineer. We can try and engineer out as best possible some of the risks, as in removing some cold water storage tanks, which may not be needed, removing some thermostatic mixing valves, which therefore may not be needed, and removing some showers or aerosol generating systems from whether it be domestic systems, hot and cold process systems, or process systems in general, cooling towers, for example. And the predominant sort of methodology of managing it from a hierarchy of control is control. Okay, we can't give people PPE, protective breathing equipment. We can't. Well, we could, but we couldn't manage it in an adequate format. So we've got to assess the risks to health arising from hazardous substances used in or created by your workplace activities. We've got to decide what precautions are needed, and you must carry out work which you must not carry out work which could expose your employees to hazardous substances without first considering the risks and the necessary precautions. And then what else do you need to do to comply with COSH? So COSH is a question. So I ask regular people. I regularly ask, I should say. Does Legionella bacteria come under COSH? Does Legionella disease come under COSH? And lots of people say no. Lots and lots of people say yes. It's a 50-50 chance. The answer, unfortunately, is yes, albeit we don't do a COSH assessment for it as per se, but indirectly we do all of the COSH requirements in a different manner. So we want to, first thing that we should do is if there's a risk, we assess that risk. We put management plans in place, control schemes. We keep records. We have all of the things that comply with COSH, but it's not a COSH risk assessment. So Legionella bacteria or Legionella disease doesn't come under COSH under biological agent. We've got to prevent or adequately control exposure, and you must prevent your employees being exposed to hazardous substances, and where preventing exposure is not reasonably practicable, then you must adequately control it. We ensure that the control measures are used and maintained properly, and that safety procedures are followed. We monitor the exposure of employees to hazardous substances if necessary, and we carry out appropriate health surveillance where your assessment has shown that this is necessary or where COSH sets specific requirements. We prepare plans, procedures to deal with accidents, incidents, emergency plans. We've all probably, over the last 5 years, we've probably developed COVID plans or plans to enable us to manage a COVID risk again. Beforehand, we probably didn't have plans to do that, but now we probably do have. So we've got to make sure we've got plans, procedures to deal with accidents, incidents, emergencies involving hazardous substances where necessary. We also ensure employees are properly informed, trained, and supervised. And trained and competency, as you well know, I'm not going to teach you to suck eggs here, but being trained and being competent are two completely different things. Being trained, we trained people, but they didn't listen. We've got to assess them for suitability and obviously review their work operating structures, whether they are following standard operating procedures and doing everything as they've been trained and instructed. And really, the key word there is, have they been assessed for suitability? Okay, so I mentioned a document earlier on, and that was the approved code of practice. And this is free now to download from the government website, the HSE website. It's free to download. It used to cost £8, but now it's free to download, and it's well worth downloading or keeping on a regular, keeping up to date with a regular basis. Albeit these documents aren't changed that frequently. We have amended HESG 274 Part 1 earlier this year in March, and that is predominantly to do with cooling towers and the management of cooling towers and specific things like PCR testing, Legionella rapid testing, etc., etc. So these things do change, so it's worth keeping an up-to-date document on your system or having access to the HSE website. And this approved code of practice is not a law and it's not guidance. It sits somewhere nicely in the middle. And every ACOP has got this sort of status. And it's a document that's not statute, and it's a document that's not quite guidance, but it is a document that has a bit of weight to it. It tells us how to keep people safe from a Legionella perspective. So it's conforming to the Health and Safety at Work Act, which doesn't tell us how to manage our risks associated with Legionella and waterborne pathogens, but this document does. And like I say, every ACUP has got it. They've got this quasi-legal status or special legal status. And it means that if you don't do, if you can do exactly what it says on the tin, if you don't do what it says on the tin, can you do something equal to it or better than that? And can you prove it? And the key point there is equal to or better than, and the ability to be able to prove that whatever you're doing is equal to or better than what it tells you to do on the tin, if that makes some sense. And if you aren't able to do what it says on the tin and you are doing something different, and you do have the ability to prove that it's working equal to or better than, then everybody's okay, everybody's happy. But if you can't prove that it's equal to or better than, then there's an opportunity for the enforcing body to take that document away and to put another document in front of you, which will be non-compliance to Health and Safety at Work Act 1974. So it's, if you can do what it says on the tin, if you can't, you've got to prove that you can do something equal to it or better than it. And that's just a bit of background on approved code of practice there. So the requirement to have a suitable and sufficient risk assessment completed is what it states, and the risk assessment must be completed by a competent person. And I suppose, what is the risk that needs to be assessed? Well, there's 4 areas, and the HSE aren't stupid. They've got a really good 3-letter acronym, CYA, at the bottom there. If anybody knows what the CYA stands for, I'm being recorded, so I'm not going to repeat it. But it does state that there are 4 areas: cooling systems with cooling towers, evaporative condensers or dry wet cooling systems, hot and cold water systems, spa pools, and other plant and systems containing water that can create and increase the risk from Legionella during operation or when being maintained. Now, that last part is a fantastic CYA, and that means basically everything and anything else where water surface tension is broken, an aerosol can be produced, therefore it has an inherent risk of being a contaminated aerosol that can be breathed in, which could be Legionella bacteria within it. Does that make sense? So anything else and anything and everything else, and what I'm talking about there are wet fire suppression systems. I'm talking about sprinkler systems. I'm talking about the Morrison's shops, where over the fruit and veg section there was a misting system, which kept the food and looking very pleasant and moist and damp and appetizing. They didn't last very long in Morrison's because there was a risk associated with the aerosols being produced and obviously the people going by. We're talking about spa pools, we're talking about swimming pools, we're talking about deluge systems, we're talking about sprinkler systems on football fields, we're talking about all of those systems that we probably see on our day-to-day basis but don't think about from a Legionella perspective. So it could be a whole myriad of things, but it's up to the site owners, the site managers, the plant managers to actually identify what those are, and therefore for them to be risk assessed by a competent risk assessor. They may need assistance from the team who actually manage those types of systems, how they worked, how they work, and how they're worked on, and how are they maintained. So lots of things need to be taken into consideration there from that section D. And then we've got a bit of a slide then about low risk systems and what's the identification of a low risk system. So these are an example of a low risk system in a small building when without people, especially at risk, where daily water usage is inevitable and sufficient to turn over the entire system, where cold water comes directly from a wholesome main supply, there's no stored water tanks, and where hot water is fed from instantaneous heaters or low storage volume water heaters, supplying outlets at 50 degrees C or greater, and where the only outlets are toilets and hand wash basins and there's no showers. Now that's deemed as being a low risk system, granted, but it's still a risk system. There isn't I don't believe there is a system out there that can produce an aerosol which we deem as no risk at all. It's about how you manage it and how you keep maintaining it going further forward. And then I suppose the other question is there really a risk? Is there really a Legionella risk? So when was the last time we heard about Legionella in the press or in the news? I'm going to talk about possibly Bibby Stockholm was the last incident where it may have come across your radar. But there's been a lot of, there are a number of outbreaks, and we've got some data here from 2016 to 2018, and the red one's 2019. Unfortunately, the data since 2019 is a little bit marred with other things. So let's say that the government had other fish to fry during 2020, 21, 22. And I mentioned it earlier, but that COVID word, I'll promise you I'll never mention it again today. But these are, we had other fish to fry at that particular moment in time, and the records or the data being gathered from a Legionella perspective was null and void. It's now moved from over to NOIDS, and NOIDS are now collecting or collating that data on a more regular basis. So in the next 2 years, 3 years, we're going to have some further information to be able to look at historically. Albeit the numbers at the moment are different from a NOIDS perspective to when we had this data from Public Health England. And as we can see, the 2016 to 2018, a 3-year mean, and then in 2019, there are some months where we've got an increase, some months where we've got a decrease, but the risk is still very much there. And as you can tell, the summer months are the more prevalent months where Legionella bacteria becomes a problem. And obviously that's due to temperature. It could be due to stagnation where people go away on holiday, summer shutdowns, etc., etc., etc. And one of the things that we feel may be an issue moving further forward is that the sort of hybrid work where lots of organizations organizations, companies, buildings, portfolios were built on the basis of having an X number of members of staff present. And obviously if we divide that number by say 2, then we've got a system there that's going to be only half used from a water perspective. So we're going to have to increase our flushing regimes or reduce the risk from removing things, ripping out things, stripping back assets, and ensuring that our water turnover is adequate for the number of staff that we've got within the premises. So that's something that we need to take a little bit of thought about going further forward. So what did the British Standard 8582 include? So there's a big old list of things that it includes from 4, 5, 5.1, etc., all the way down to 10. And the ACUP L8 and the HSG 274 don't tell you how to complete the risk assessment. They detail the need to have a suitable and sufficient assessment completed by a competent person, but they don't tell you, but they don't tell you how to do it. So what should this suitable and sufficient risk assessment consider? And these are all of the things that should be included. So a desktop appraisal of documentation, always a good idea to send the documentation to the risk assessment team prior to their site visit, because they are wasting time when they're on site, taking a look at documentation, or for you to try and get that information readily available. If they can have access to all of that information beforehand, it makes it a lot more efficient process whilst on site. And you're not looking for things and they're not looking for things, and you end up with a much better looking risk assessment, because at the end of the day, that risk assessment needs to be as good and as defined, refined, accurate, with all of the supporting information readily available, so that risk assessment can give you a glowing report. And it's not always about, risk assessment is going to be negative. A risk assessment can actually be quite positive in regards to you've got lots and lots of things in place. The risk assessor has had access, they've got visuals on it, they've seen it, they know it's in place. It's just a case of saying, okay, we need to do this, we need to tweak that, these things have changed, the nomenclature from a blind end to a dead leg may have changed, and all of those other bits and bats. It's just about keeping up to date, refreshing, and having that as a live document. So this shouldn't be seen as a sort of a donkey kick, if you will. This should be to say that, okay, this document is there to support what we've already got in place. And as such, a risk assessment no longer look at the water systems in a property. It's not a condition survey. And over the next few slides, I'm hopefully going to take these elements of the risk assessment, we'll explain them a little bit further. And as I mentioned, it's not a condition survey. So we need to look at each of these as part of the risk assessment process. And contamination. So Legionella is a naturally occurring organism. It's ubiquitous, appearing to be everywhere. It's found in rivers, lakes, reservoirs, ponds, streams. It can be in your mains water system at low concentrations, because they don't have to provide us with sterile water. It's wholesome, potable drinking water that they need to provide us with. And as we know, that Legionella bacteria can be drunk until we're blue in the face. It only becomes an issue when it becomes an aerosol and inhaled into the lungs. And those aerosols have got to be small, 5 micron or less, to be inhaled into the deepest, darkest tissues of your lungs. We also need to know how a water system can be contaminated, colonized. Is there enough nutrients within the system? And contamination through low flow, no flow, biofilms, for example. From an amplification perspective, we're looking at the growth of Legionella within the water system. And we need somewhere to live with food and some heat. And the same is true with Legionella bacteria. They need somewhere to live, they need some food, and they need some warmth. From a transmission perspective, the water that contains Legionella, which is transmitted to a human through inhalation or aspiration and breathing in small droplets of water, becomes an issue or can become an issue. Indoor sprays with water from water coolers or water outlets or devices, and outdoor from larger devices such as cooling towers or water features. And cooling towers, the aerosols generated within a cooling tower and fountains, for example, that are outside, have got the capacity to travel many kilometers. There's a white paper that's being written at the moment that's suggesting that those can travel up to 5 kilometers. And the reason why they've increased in areas that they can pass or travel through is because of the clean air, or the cleaner air that we're trying to develop, if you will. So we're trying to reduce poor contaminated air pollution. And the cleaner the air, the further they believe these aerosols can travel. So we win on one and we lose on another. But there you go. And I suppose that the next one is exposure. And the closer to the source, the more likelihood to be exposed to atomized water that is created, for example, in a spa pool. And susceptibility. So everybody's susceptible. We're just some are more susceptible than others, but these also need to be considered. And what I mean by that is is there a cancer care centre? Are the people within the cancer care centre more susceptible than the people within a university or school or college? Well, from a susceptibility perspective, the indication is obviously yes, that the cancer care centre are going to be more susceptible people within them. And therefore, it's got to be taken into consideration from a building perspective, but also surrounding area perspective as well, from a cooling tower, for example. And then we're going to look at competency of the risk assessor. And one of the things that we look at on a regular basis is the risk assessor competent to actually do a risk assessment, an adequate risk assessment on the type of building or type of premises or types of equipment to be found within that premises. And what I mean by that is, would you send a person who's only ever done risk assessments on domestic dwellings to go and do a risk assessment on a hospital or a power station? So what I mean is that person who does the risk assessment, they've got to have adequate knowledge of the pinch points, the issues, the areas of concern that could that happen within those sort of industry sectors, if that makes sense. And you need to ensure that the SA is competent to complete the risk assessment for you. And it's your responsibility to make sure that that risk assessor, not necessarily the risk assessment company, the risk assessor is competent to do it for you. And then this is what's been emphasized in the approved code of practice. And this is about duty holder must ensure that the person who carries out the risk assessment and provides advice on prevention and control of exposure must be competent to do so. So have they got relevant knowledge within your industry sector, within the relevant things that you have got on site? And then how do you drill that down a little bit further? Okay, so the LCA, there's a membership scheme, which the HCA detail in the approved code of practice in HSG 274 is a possible source for support. So those who are on the actual LCA. And then we're looking at the sort of a desktop appraisal of documentation now. And this is about the condition survey. It's not a look at the water systems, take some temperatures and notes on the status of condition. This is not a risk assessment. In order to assess the risk, you need to consider how the risk is currently being managed. So we've got to do a desktop appraisal of documentation. And like I said before, give them as much information as you possibly can. It'll paint you in a better picture if you've got all access to infrequently used outlet flushing register, management plans, hierarchy of control, structures, incident plans, shutdown startup procedures. Have you got an organogram? Who's the responsible person? Who's the deputy? What was the training aspects? What's the competency assessments of these people? Does the duty holder, have they signed for them in the HR folder? Is everybody aware of the responsibility? Is the written scheme up to date? Is it accurate? Has it got all of the things that are needed to ensure that everything is covered? Have we got those things that we've never even thought of? Are they in place? Okay, so in order to assess the risk, you need to consider how the risk assessment is currently being managed, agreed, and these are the things that we look for from a desktop appraisal of current control scheme, maintenance, testing records, the management responsibilities, training records, competency checks, safe operation of the system, appraisal of the monitoring and inspection records. And before looking around the building at the water systems, there is the need to look at the entire management system that drives how Legionella is being managed within the organisation and the property. So, i.e., if the RP hasn't had adequate training, how good is their knowledge and understanding of what is required? And is it a good or bad occurrence or situation? And if the RP hasn't had training, how do they instill some control, some confidence? And how do they pass that information to the competent people who are doing it and those in specifically who are doing the tests? Do they know why they're doing the test? Do they know how to do them properly? Do they know what to do if things aren't quite right? Temperature's out of spec. Shunt pump's not working, or anti-stratification pump's not working. Shower heads have not been cleaned and disinfected. TMVs that are not functioning correctly, for example. And that lack of training of an RP can then cascade, and as I mentioned, can cascade down and be reflected upon how they require the risk to be managed or not, given their lack of training, for example. And then after that desktop appraisal, there is a need to look at the risk systems within the property, actually physically go and check these things, take some temperatures, look at flow rates, dead legs, areas of concern. And this actually requires the assessor to look at the current asset list and visit that item, device, and system and assess it. It's not a drive-by. It's not a cut and paste approach to risk assessments. We've done it before, therefore it's a quick look at the survey. So an appraisal or a risk assessment review used to be quite, from a water treatment or water hygiene company's perspective, used to be more of a pop in half a day as opposed to a day. So if the original risk assessment took a day, the risk assessment review took less. But now that's been negated, and there used to be a 2-year window on that review period, but now it's been identified that when there have been major changes, or when there have been changes to the system, when there have been changes to the building, when there have been changes to key personnel, if you've been involved in a Legionella outbreak, for example, if new documentation becomes available, those are the 5 or 6 different things that can be or should be considered when to do a risk assessment review. That 2-year time frame has been taken out because if things don't change, then there's no reason to do a risk assessment review, whether it takes half a day or whatever it takes. But that risk assessment review now should be as thorough as the original risk assessment. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. And the reason why we have to do this nowadays is because when a property burnt down, yet the risk assessor was able to issue a risk assessment report for the building 6 months after the fire. Now that was what we class as a drive-by. They didn't do an awful lot, and they didn't visit the site. They didn't do a proper job. For them to be able to produce a risk assessment 6 months after it burnt down is a little bit farcical, and obviously that organisation lost a bit of credibility there, let's say. Now we're looking at measurements. Okay, so looking at temperature control. Temperature control is the traditional control strategy, and for me, it's still the best methodology of controlling waterborne pathogens, especially Legionella bacteria. Keep the hot, hot, keep the cold, cold, keep it all moving, keep it clean, and keep it well managed. And we need to monitor temperatures. And some thoughts on that are, I keep doing that, don't I? Sorry, apologies. The person completing the routine checks, have they been trained? There are different types of thermometers, immersion, contact, dual gauges on vessels, for example, BMS systems. Do they know how to use them correctly and how? Where to record the data? When was the thermometer checked, calibrated? I'm assuming that there's not many people that check the gauges on vessels and calibrate the gauges on vessels. And how reliable, therefore, is the data? And is this data providing evidence on the state of compliance? If it's not right, then false assurances are being provided. And when there is doubt about the efficacy of the thermometer from the desk-based appraisal, the risk assessor would be inclined to take more temperature readings to test the system to see if it is compliant. What about testing for Legionella? Well, testing for Legionella is not a prerequisite for a Legionella risk assessment. They are included as a bit of a money spinner in our opinion. Now, British Standard 8580 details clearly when a sample might want to be taken as part of that risk assessment. And British Standard 7592 details how to take a Legionella sample, pre and post need and the technique. So sampling at a risk assessment at the time of a risk assessment is often just add-on costs. It's not a prerequisite, doesn't need to be done. And I think it sometimes takes a little bit away from the actual risk assessment because they've got to go and take the samples, take them correctly, got to drop them off at the laboratory, and it's all time that could be used better spent, in my opinion, actually assessing the risk in a bit more detail. Risk rating systems. So we're looking at L8 and British Standard 8580 don't detail a scoring method. And the 8580 details the need for a scoring matrix to be defined and included in the risk assessment. And the risk should not just be defined by the highest risk issue. Risk matrix needs to consider contamination, amplification, transmission, and exposure, growth, aerosol, exposure. And what are we talking about? So as touched on earlier, susceptibility of the occupants needs to be considered as such, and this will impact on the risk rating. The susceptibility of the individuals. So occupants has a massive impact on that risk rating. And the report should be clear and concise. It's not pages and pages of repeating guidance and history of Legionella. You know, the first outbreak was at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1976. Dr. E. Campbell was the first person who notified the Pennsylvania Health Board and all that sort of stuff. You don't need to know about that. It's not relevant. You can come on courses or sessions like this and find that information out, but it's not necessarily needed to be in a Legionella risk assessment. And that's what I was talking about before, about making them a bit more user-friendly, not just full of paraphernalia and bumf. It needs to have an action plan, risk minimization scheme, and it needs to include a priority status for the recommendations. The deadlines for the prioritized actions need to be agreed by the responsible person and the water safety group, however. And how can a risk assessor determine deadlines for an organization? They don't control their budget. So on a regular basis, I see risk assessments that say you've got a high risk priority, you've got 3 months to complete it. Well, that's already giving the person who's reading that risk assessment a bit of a kick in, because they may have plans for that building. They may have plans for that cooling tower to be decommissioned in the next 2 years. I think that those things need to be in, for me, they need to be RAG report, red, amber, green. Yes, it's a high risk, but what can you do other than what my advice is? Are the ways of managing that system better? Are the ways of reducing the risk associated to it? What can we do to, again, can we avoid spending £50,000 on it if we're going to spend £100,000 on it in 2 years' time? Can we manage that risk slightly different, but can we manage it? And therefore, we have ticked a couple of boxes as opposed to prioritizing that deadline of 3 months with the risk assessor's recommendation that may or may not be viable for you. I hope that makes a bit of sense. And therefore, having completed a broad overview of what the British Standard 8580 requires from a risk assessment perspective, there's some of the items discussed will and may already have the mind racing, and it would be worth looking at the content of the British Standard 8580 and completing a tick list to see if you comply. And again, you get a copy, if I remember right, Graham, we do give a copy out of this presentation, so you've got this information to hand if you need to.
Yeah.
Perfect. And I'm getting up to 22. So the key points to take away: Legionella risk assessments are a requirement of regulations and guidance. Guidance details what needs to be assessed, doesn't tell you how. The British Standard 8580 version 1 2019 details the approach for undertaking a Legionella risk assessment, and Legionella risk assessments which meet the criteria of British Standard 8580 version 1 2019 look to the LCA membership. There's over 300 members who can complete Legionella risk assessments. And to refine that a little bit further, you can look to UCAS accreditation. There's only 13 companies in the UK accredited for the UCAS accredited Legionella risk assessments. We use UCAS for a number of things, calibrations, etc., testing procedures. Samples have got to go to a UCAS accredited laboratory, for example, to give it a little bit of gravitas. And the Legionella risk assessments need to be completed by competent individuals who is independent from vested interest. So this is one of the things that lots of organizations have a one-stop shop, which isn't, I'm not going to say that's good or bad. It's per people's preference. But from my side of things, I want to follow the British Standard 8580, which suggests that we have an independent risk assessment completed by a company who hasn't got vested interest in monitoring, sampling, and doing the day-to-day aspects of how they manage your risk associated with Legionella and waterborne pathogens. Just to let you know, there has been some updates to British Standard 8580 from a Pseudomonas perspective. And 7592 consultation document was out in 2022. I know it's 2024 now, and I can't remember whether that's been updated or not. I think it has. I will confirm. And then finally, follow us to receive any weekly blogs. So if anybody does follow the Water Hygiene Centre, we do have 5 senior consultants who behave as authorising engineers or competent help or auditors or whatever it is that we need them to do. And they write blogs on a regular basis. And these are not sales blogs. These are blogs what clients have come across and asked for. And we do quite a number. And they're on our website. They're free to download. I think you do have to subscribe, but that subscription is just a communication perspective. So we gather a bit of detail and then communicate these blogs. And as I mentioned, it's not a sales patter. There's very, very little, less than I would like, because I'm the commercial director, so I'd like a little bit more. But from a company perspective, we decide not to. And there's an opportunity to have a look at those blogs. And there's also academy videos that we've got about certain things, taking temperatures, sampling, and flushing a lot of used outlets. And there's a myriad of information readily available on our websites, and we do these social media events as well. Thank you for listening, and as I hoped, as I mentioned earlier, it's not the sexiest of subjects, so I hope it's kept some people engaged and interested. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank everybody for their attendance.
Thanks a lot, Peter. So I'll stop the presentation from being shared, and I'll hand you over to Mark and Steve, who are going to run through any questions that have been posted through the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. We have one from Amanda Oldman. Amanda, do you want to come on and speak, or do you want me to read it out for you? It's up to you.
Yeah, it was just it's just something that we're looking at the minute, which is why I've sort of jumped on this. I'm actually on annual leave, so I will admit I am actually still sat here in my pajamas, so there is no way on God's earth I'm putting my camera on.
Absolutely fine, don't worry.
But it was just sort of just some clarification of, like, from what I've read, it's best practice to refresh your responsible person's training every 3 years. But I can't see it as a legal requirement. So it's just some clarification on the best way of kind of managing that.
Please.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. You're absolutely right. It's every 3 years, the RP should be trained. And for the life of me, I can't remember the documents. Could I grab your email address in some way, shape, or form, and I can get you the paragraph where it's located?
Yeah, am I okay to just put it in the chat box?
Yeah, that's fine, Amanda.
Perfect.
That's fab. Thank you ever such a lot.
No problem.
Okay, next one. Question from Ronnie McNamee. Do you want to come on, Ronnie?
Hiya. I think I put a couple questions in there.
Okay.
Just trying to get clarity really, probably on some simple things. But we have a large kind of varied tenure stock. It's all residential stock. It's not commercial, where there's the high risk, but we have sheltered housing with vulnerable tenants. And we have them on a quarterly shower clean regime, and it's quite a bit of a nightmare sometimes because we can't always get access, and so some showers always get cleaned and some don't, but we have just changed the tenure of these properties from sheltered to retirement plus, which reduces the vulnerability. And I was just looking to see if we still need to include those shower cleans in the water control scheme, or is there a requirement to do that? It seems, I certainly wouldn't want someone coming in my house cleaning my shower on a quarterly basis, but.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so you're absolutely right. From a perspective of cleanliness, yes, they should be quarterly disinfected, both the shower head and the hose. If you have got a vulnerable residence and you've taken ownership of that and you are letting those flats out, then from a contractual obligation, you would have an obligation to perform those, which you've tried to do. Some get done, some don't. I appreciate that. From a so let's say, for example, if I was letting out a property as a landlord, I would need to write into my contract with the tenant that they, as a duty of care, I have done a low risk assessment, Legionella risk assessment, and as part of that risk assessment, it's identified that shower heads, hoses need to be cleaned on a quarterly basis. As part of your contractual obligation, this should be included within that contract to ensure that they are aware of their responsibilities, but also to avoid responsibility from you guys. That's what I would be looking at and suggesting. Right.
So it's good to include them. I was looking to see if we needed to further include them, or if that was overkill. I just wasn't sure because some of these are mains fed.
Electric showers.
Sorry.
Mains fed electric showers.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, they still need to be done in some way,
Right.
shape, or form. So it's either you or the tenant.
Right. So it's less on the water supply and more on the vulnerability of the tenant.
And also the risk. Yeah. So irrespective of whether that is a water supply, it's a mains water supply or stored water or hot stored water. There's obviously the heating of the element. There's heating of that. The scale potential. There's bacteriological contamination potential from a heat perspective and scale perspective at the shower head and also within the hose. So
Right.
irrespective of whether it's a hot supply through a mixer valve or whether it's a main supply, they still need to be done. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
Perfect.
I think I had two questions back to back there. The next question was, there was like 4 points of bullet points of what needed to be included in to determine the risk rating, and I didn't capture what those points were.
Contamination, amplification, transmission, and exposure.
Fantastic. Thank you.
No problems.
Just to mention this, this session is recorded as well, so you can go back onto it. We'll give it access on our website. It'll be uploaded in due course, so you can look back and obviously have access to the slides as well.
Fantastic. Thanks.
Okay, next question from Anita Mazvaleska. Do you want to come on, Anita? Okay, Anita's asked if there's not the standards in place, what alternatives do we have? So for the BS A581 2019, is there any alternatives to use, Pete?
No.
Okay.
Is the answer to that. No. That's the British standard. And as as everybody is well aware, we love a British standard. We love a standard. We love a document to tell us how to do it. This is the document that tells us how to do it. There's a bit of information in the HSG 274, and there's a bit of information in the approved code of practice. But this one's predominantly telling you how to do a risk assessment and what it needs to cover.
Thank you. Sorry, I was on mute. I was just, we have a third party like every other big company. We have a third party, Legionella, assistance control, but they've not mentioned the British standard anywhere. So I was like getting concerned. Is there any alternative? But thank you. I will double check that.
Yeah, they should be referring to the British standard now. And if they're not, they're still in the approved code of practice and HSG 274 aspects. That'll be written within the risk assessment, no doubt.
Okay, thanks, Anita. Got one from Andrew Butt. Andrew, do you want to come in? I think Andrew was just saying that the ACOP and the HSG 274 states the responsible person for water should receive regular refresher training. This is accepted as being appropriate for every 2 to 3 years. This is correct, isn't it, Pete?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, but I literally cannot remember the paragraph. I do apologise. I will flagellate myself due to lack of.
It's fine. Okay. Next one from Shelley Craven. Shelley, would you like to come on?
Hi. We're in the process of actually I want to say replumbing, but it's not replumbing in its sense. The main areas of our hot water system and our heating system. So it's all new pipe work from the plant room. Obviously getting rid of some dead legs that we have in the plant room. Once this is done by the contractor, do they do the risk assessment? Do they do the checks? And then we do a follow-up risk assessment? I just needed to clarify what is our role as the school on how to protect going forward, that they've done all their corrections once setup is done.
Couple of things there, Shelley. Depending on the contract that you've got in place and what the proposal was, they may well do a risk assessment at the beginning when they started the job. They should have done one during, and they should do one at the end as a handover perspective. I don't believe it may well be in place. I would be surprised if it is, but it may well be in place, that sort of regime. They should also provide you with a commissioning document to say that they have disinfected the pipework and the system to ensure that there is no contamination. They should have taken some samples to prove that it is clean. They should leave them a certain specific number of days after they've done the commission clean to take the samples to ensure that there's no, you're not basically taking the disinfected system sample straight away. You leave it a few days to ensure that there is potential, if there is further growth or contamination, that it's going to be picked up and monitored. And then if they have handed over you a working system that's been commissioned correctly, sampled correctly, flushed correctly, managed correctly, and there is a risk assessment produced, then that's your job done up until you start to have your management plan in place, and then you need another risk assessment, which will give you more of what your day-to-day tasks are. So your understanding was accurate, that they should give you a risk assessment at the end, but they should also make sure it's commissioned correctly, sampled, and ready to use for you.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thanks, Shelley. Okay, we've got next question from Robert MacDonald. Robert, do you want to come on?
Yeah, no problem at all. Just a quick question. When you're getting a Legionella or a Pseudomonas risk assessment carried out in healthcare now, does it have to stipulate where the sample locations are?
That's a great question. Does it have to stipulate where, as in where you've taken them from?
No. Where they would recommend you take them from. So they carry out a risk assessment of a site. So with healthcare up in Scotland, we were trying to implement the Pseudomonas guidance, samples have to be taken every 6 months, so you need to get Pseudomonas risk assessment carried out. But from that risk assessment, we were looking for the risk assessor company to stipulate the sample points, so that then when they come back to take the samples, for instance, that's the points they'll take the samples from.
No, and the reason I believe that is the case is because a Pseudomonas risk assessment takes into consideration however many points in regards to that particular outlet, and I suppose then the risks associated with that particular outlet will depend on the ongoing usage, and that then needs to be.
The big problem that we find is, say we carry out Pseudomonas risk assessment on the site, it'd be the same with Legionella risk assessment, and say you do start, middle, of end of a system like you normally would. From a Pseudomonas guidance point of view, if you carry out that routine samples at that location and you find nothing, fine. But if you find anything, potentially you have to sample all the outlets in that ward,
That's right,
that department, to find out what it is. So from a budgeting point of view going forward, that's a horrendous job. Because if you get a hit or a detection in a ward or a department anywhere, every outlet needs to be sampled, and then you need to get 3 clear samples before you can move on.
That's right. Yep, absolutely. So Pseudomonas is in my opinion one of the most difficult bacteria to try and understand. So lots of people, there's been a working forum in Europe about this as to whether Pseudomonas only goes 2 meters from the point of from the outlet, or whether it can be inherent within the system. And I believe any biofilm that can be sheared in any way, shape, or form has got a potential to be inherent within the system. There's a big old argument about it as to whether it can only grow 2 meters further back from the actual outlet. I don't know whether you what your thoughts on that, Robert, are, but from I'll ask you that in a second. But you're absolutely right. A positive result. You have to then take lots of samples in and around that location to try and identify where that location issue is, which is very difficult to budget for. And then you do have to have 3 consecutive. From in the NHS, you do have to have 3 consecutive negatives.
It's a horrendous thing. If you ever come across Pseudomonas at all, it's horrendous to get rid of. We had a brand new build, had Pseudomonas detected in one outlet, carried out 2-3 disinfections, multiple things. We ended up ripping it all out and having to start again, and that was the only way to get rid of it. So the cost for it is huge. Now with the healthcare coming in, we're wanting the risk assessment company to stipulate set locations from the risk assessments where the samples can be taken, so that we can get a good overview of the system, and then we can go from there. But it's just, if there was anything stipulated in any of the guidance that as part of a risk assessment, they should stipulate that locations.
No, and again, the only reason I can think of there, Graham, is because it can be contaminated. It's obviously Pseudomonas can be found on any part of your body. It's going to be cross contamination in the plug hole, regurgitation from the plug hole, inadequate cleaning mechanisms. It's not the eightfold cleaning process. And I suppose the issue there is can the contamination occur externally from the water system, which it can. So it would be difficult to actually say, if you sample here, here, and here, your rest of it's going to be fine. That's all I can think.
Yeah, this is the big problem that we're poised with at the moment, because the guidance is still in draft in Scotland. It's not fully out. It's not fully implemented. And there's nothing in it that says that you take start, middle, and end, or whether every ward department outlet as a routine needs to be sampled. So the guidance is quite woolly at the moment to do with it.
Yeah.
Legionella is slightly different, because you could have it systemic within the system. So you will get hits in multiple outlets throughout the place. Whereas Pseudomonas, it could be one room, one person, or one bad cleaner cleaning one room.
Yep.
The rest of it could be clear, but if you get a positive hit, you have to sample a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you're looking at recirculating systems as well. Could be causing further contamination upstream. Yeah, it's problematic. Let's say that.
It's a minefield, is how I would put it.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
thanks, Robert.
absolutely.
Thanks for your question.
No worries.
Okay, last couple of questions. We have one from Bernie Woods. Would you like to come on, Bernie?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. And see you.
Okay. Yeah. Hopefully only a quick one. It's around showers and shower heads. We have a shower in the premises we use. It's quite a small premises. You know, you kind of looking about the size of a 4 or 5 bedroom house. But there's one shower which is not used anymore. It was only used when volunteers were on shift overnight. And my question is really around. I've always been the quandary about, do we just keep disinfecting it and ensuring it runs regularly, etc., or do we actually just take the shower head off so it can't be, you know, it can't be used and it's not going to flow? But does that then leave a potential dead leg where you get something flowing back into the system? It's a mains fed system, electric shower mains fed system. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts were on, is one or the other a better option there?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Thanks, Bernie, for the question. It's a great point. The better option is to have the shower head and hose connected and disinfected. But the best option would be engineer it totally out. So
I understand that, but we're a charity, so I'm always looking for the least cost option. If you can,
absolutely. I would suggest that you'd go back to the flow, to the drop where that water is being taken from, and put a T-piece in. Put a straight piece in as opposed to a T-piece.
Yeah.
And freeze. What I would suggest is we freeze if you can't isolate and you need to do it in situ. Freeze, take out, fit, and decommission totally.
I'd agree. That's the best option ultimately. But I'm because I've kept the shower head running, and I've kept doing that because I thought it was less risk than the. So thank you for that, much appreciated, and thanks for the presentation this afternoon. Really good.
No problem. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Bernie. Okay, next question. Last couple now. From Scott Goldsmith. You still on, Scott? Do you want to come on?
Hi there. Yes, I'm still here. Great presentation. Thanks very much, guys. I've come from the health service and I'm now working in a different industry. We've got a closed chilled water system that cools that plant. If any new pipework's being installed, should we be chlorinating it beforehand as we would in the health service?
That's a great question because it's chilled water. So is it an open or closed loop system?
It's a closed loop system.
But either way, yes. Sorry, it doesn't matter whether it's closed. I've got to be honest now, Scott. It's because you've got contaminants in there. You could contaminate with bacteria. So again, Pseudomonas could be there. You've got other types of bacteria. So yes, all newly fitted pipework should be commission cleaned.
Fantastic. Thanks for answering that.
No problem.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Last question now, guys. Okay, so Chantel Neighbour, would you like to come on?
I would if I could find out how to unmute this.
Yep, you're live.
I'm aware, or I've seen it previously, where you can no longer use the sort of metal braided flexible hosing in sort of commercial properties. But I struggle to find the documentation. So when I'm trying to sort of let my clients know about this change and that you can't really use it as a cheap way of doing it, I just need to know where the document that specifies it is, because I really struggle to find it.
Yeah, no problem. Can I grab your email address again, Chantel, and just look?
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
Couple of things there. The flexible hoses. I think it was Dr. Tom Makin who's helped, it pioneered sort of a Legionella sort of awareness over the last 20 years. He did an analysis on the flexible hoses, the internals. They're made of rubber potentially. The rubber is an organic food source. It's got lots of locations for biofilm to form, and it was a really good source for harbouring Legionella bacteria and other biofilms. And the recommendation is it's got to be RAS approved, but ideally we should hard plumb rather than flexible pipe. Now flexibles were invented and they do a great job because lots of things can move. dishwashers, washing machines, etc., etc. But can we hard plumb as opposed to flexible hose installations for domestic sinks, basins, etc., etc.? But yeah, I will find where that exactly is in the documentation, and I'll send an email over to you.
Is that okay, Chantal?
Yes, that's grand. Thanks. Sorry, I'm doing this on my phone rather than my laptop, and it's can't find everything.
No, that's fine. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for your great questions. Thanks, Pete, for getting through them. Back over to you, Graham, to close.
Thanks, Mark. So, Peter, thanks again for taking the time to deliver the presentation and hang around to answer any questions that any of the members had. Feel free to hang around. We normally move into a networking session now to see if anyone wants to stay on and talk to each other or ask any of the members of the committee any questions. So Paul, if you could stop